Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I have to record this so we can hear it on the live stream. And so we're going to start tonight. As you all know, the topic is loneliness. And when I was looking for meditation, I found this excerpt from the latest quarterly, Lutheran Women's Quarterly. I found mine upstairs, and it says, praying the Psalms, and a prayer for one who is brokenhearted, offered after reading Psalms 35. And it talks about, in Psalms 35, I was reading through it, it's a lot of, the individual feels so oppressed, and people are against them, and why are they lashing out toward us, me, if I'm the person that's feeling persecuted. And it says, Lord, my spirit is crushed. To you I cry, help me with my troubles. How long will I feel this way? I know you're there, but there are those days, Lord, days when I can hardly put one foot in front of the other. Days when the fog surrounding me is so thick, days when I cannot see the way. I know you are there. I know you are there, Lord, on these special days when I feel so alone. I want to feel your love through the touch of another human. Sometimes I feel an overwhelming flood of contempt washing over me. Why are these people so hurtful? Why are their words like arrows piercing my very soul, holding me down and pinning me to that dark place? Do they really mean to harm me? Am I misinterpreting what they say? Am I misinterpreting what they mean to tell me? Whether the problem is the words they speak or the interpretation my mind puts on them, say to my soul, I am your salvation. That's verse 36 from verse 3 from Psalm 35. You alone can deliver me from such overwhelming sadness. O gracious God, continue to my defense. Fight against any enemy who assails me from within or without. Contend with such evil ones in my life. Let their way be dark and slippery from the angel of the Lord pursuing them. Counsel me with your word, your truth. Hold my hand and raise me from this dark pit. Restore your joy to my own life so others will see and praise. Praising you, saying with me, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong for him, the poor and needy from him who robs him. If I fall again and return to my how long question, rescue me, for my life is in your hands. You know my needs. Speak so I cannot help but hear you. You are my help, O Lord, ever present and when I need you, ever present whenever I need you, all knowing in whatever is best for me at any point in my life. Great is the Lord who delights in the welfare of his servant. And then the author ends with the prayer, and I'm going to just embellish this a little bit. So let's have a prayer, please. Lord, I am your servant. I am honored by your care and delight in me. I'm humbled and humbly grateful that you are the great God and Lord of my life. Heavenly Father, be with us tonight as we talk about the human condition of loneliness. Guide us, be with us, and help us understand that this happens to all of us throughout our life. But you're there to guide us and pull us out of that pit of darkness, as our author says. Show us your way and let us see the ways in which we can help one another and be raised from a time of loneliness in our life. Thank you for this beautiful day and for being with us this evening. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so on we go. I'm just going to double check and make sure I'm recording. Okay, we're on. So tonight I want to talk to you. Last year I was asked to give a presentation for the National Parish Nurse meeting on loneliness. And boy, I'll tell you, I've learned a lot about loneliness in the last year. And I'd like to share some of that with you this evening, and we'll have time for discussion at the end. But it truly is being called the new pandemic in our country. Just, Paula, I'm going to take, well, does it bother you folks to have Paula up in the corner? Paula, we'll just leave you there. I can just leave the slides for you, but I'll leave you there. You look good. Okay.
That's fine.
Right, we're on. Okay. So when we talk about loneliness in our life today, I tried to give some objectives that would help define it for you. Loneliness is as defined, we'll talk about, and we'll explore loneliness and isolation. I need to tell you that I have included apathy, but when we get to that, I have some thoughts about that because I think too many times people who are very lonely are seen as apathetic and non-caring. And so there's confusion between the two. So we'll try to define that. I will. And then what is it that makes us more prone to being lonely in our life? What are the signs and symptoms? What impacts us the most? And then we're going to talk a little bit about solitude, because one of the authors I found is a wonderful young woman, an Irish woman, that talks about the positive nature of loneliness. So Mother Teresa said a long time ago that the most terrible poverty is loneliness and the feeling of being unloved. And we all experience this at some point in our life, maybe briefly, maybe for long periods, but loneliness is part of the human condition. It's defined as Webster as a state of being singular. It doesn't say alone always, it's being singular, not one of a group, solitary, lacking company, and goes on to say that loneliness is a response that we feel for social connection. If our need for social connection is not met, we can feel quite lonely. It also triggers the fight or flight mechanism, and loneliness is considered a defense mechanism. When we start to feel the flight or fight mechanism spark up in our body, that's when our heart rate increases. We start breathing faster, and that's the symptom for all kinds of conditions: panic, anxiety, fear, but also for loneliness. Pain or loneliness is like pain. There is a reason that we're lonely. There is a reason, and it's subjective. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it's a defense mechanism in many times. And because of that, we tend to isolate and pull ourselves away from others. And it just makes the loneliness worse. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Loneliness affects how we feel about ourselves, which you certainly would understand, and how we interact with others. It distorts our perception of the world. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you a circular drawing that explains that. But when we're lonely and feeling isolated, we see people differently. You know, I look out, and if I'm lonely, I think, well, gee, they don't really want me here, and they're really pretty critical of me, and I don't think I want to be involved, you know, with social groups and go out, and people withdraw even more. It really diminishes our feeling of self-worth. And the two authors in their book on loneliness says that other people may appear more critical, more competitive, denigrating, or otherwise unwelcoming. So the fear of rejection puts us on their defense, and we isolate ourselves even more. In grief, we many times don't want to reach out to people at that point in time, so we pull ourselves in and isolate. And when we do that with emotions like that, they grow deeper, and they can be even more difficult to deal with in the future. So here's the vicious cycle. So in the top upper left, we feel lonely many times. When we feel lonely, we want to be around others. We want that security, that connectedness I talked about. But because loneliness distorts our perception of others, you know, I'd like to go to that church group, that ministry group this week, but gee whiz, you know, I wonder what they think of me. And they might be critical, and I don't know if I want to be involved in a small group where they'll ask me questions. And it just spirals downward to the point the individual starts to isolate themselves more and pull back and withdraw more. So that is really a crucial point. If you know someone that's experiencing this, or you yourself feel that you're kind of falling into that pit of loneliness, like the speaker on Psalms 35, that should give you a red flag, because as we say in our support groups, to need help or to ask for help is a strength. Never feel like asking for help is a weakness. It isn't. And so a lot of people say, well, I don't know what to do about this loneliness. I can't seem to get out of it. Well, that's maybe when they need to talk to someone else and get some support. Loneliness is being titled the new pandemic in our country, in the world actually. 40% of all Americans say they lack meaningful relationships in their lives. And the wonderful news is that none of us are really alone. If we have a faith, if we believe in God, God is there for us, and so are many other people. But again, we have to be willing to reach out. Loneliness and isolation seem to be the root of so much of our pain, and yet today we are more connected digitally and with all media than we've ever been, and yet loneliness is at a high. We know we can't avoid it. It's common to every human experience. And Max Lucado, I'll show you his book later. Max Lucado is a wonderful Christian writer. And he's got a book out. This is from God Will Help You that I'll also show you. But he talks about we are never alone. And over in the book, he says, remember, to be lonely at times in our life can be very normal. It can be very common. So here's just a couple of studies. I didn't belabor it a lot, but there's some that really stand out. And Dr. Juliet Holt did this study in 2015. And if you're into statistics at all, you shouldn't use data more than 4 or 5 years old, But I read this and I can't believe these statistics. And I looked at future studies and they haven't changed. Health risk associated with loneliness and social isolation compare with the dangers of smoking and obesity, increasing mortality by 30%. And for those of you that know me, you know that I still work about 1 day a month at Mayo as a tobacco counselor, and loneliness is likened to smoking 2/3 of a pack of cigarettes a day. That's a lot of cigarettes. And who would have ever thought? But it really has an impact on us. It increases the risk of death by 26%. And if you combine social isolation and living alone, that can increase people's mortality rate up to 32%. Now, I'm not saying if you live alone, this is the statistics. This is if someone lives alone and they're lonely and they don't have support systems and people around them. On the other hand, if we all have social connections and we have support, it counterbalances that because the mortality is lowered by 30%. So what that's saying is if we have support systems around us and people that give us, sort of nourish our spirit, that will counter that depression, particularly if people get help for it. Here's another really interesting study. In one of the largest hospitals in the country, Parkland Hospital of Dallas, Texas, saw 80 people 5,139 times in 12 months. So only 80 people visited the ER at Parkland Memorial 1,139 times. That's a lot of visits. And of course, they had to get the people's permission to do this ongoing study for a year. They all went to the ER. And even though that poverty and food shortage were number 2 and 3, loneliness was the number 1 reason they visited the ER. Number 1 reason. And people, many times are shocked by that, but I think that happens obviously it happens a lot, but I've seen that over and over here because when we're lonely, we start having physical symptoms. We'll talk about that. And so a lot of things are exacerbated when we're lonely and we think, oh my gosh, I'm having chest palpitations. I need to go to the ER. What if it's my heart? Or shortness of breath. What's going on with my lungs? Those are all many times symptoms of loneliness. You all have heard of Chris Tomlin, the music songwriter. I'm going to move us over here for a second. Loneliness and isolation seem to be the root of so much of our pain, but we're more digitally connected than ever, and our society is feeling lonelier by the day. Pretty profound. And this was also part of the preface to Dr. Max Lucado's book, You're Never Alone. I'm sorry, I'll make you dizzy, Paula. I'm going to keep moving us around here. When in our lives do you think we feel the most lonely? And this is when we ask the question, where's God? Where's God in my life? It's subjective. Loneliness is subjective. Somebody else can't tell us what it is in our life. We know what it's like in our life. One person's fear of being alone is another person's solitude. And I'm going to talk to you about that. There's a wonderful book written, I think I mentioned that, by a young Irish writer. And she says, Thanks to Loneliness. And I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And she was alone a large part of her adult life as she was younger, in her young years, early 20s. And she turned that around to be a source of solitude and getting to know herself better. And, meditating more and finding things that she really found value in. And in the end, it gave her a lot of strength. So it's how we use it and where we're at in our life, how vulnerable we're feeling as to whether or not we can use it positively. Remember again that loneliness is an unmet need for social connection. And if many people only see it that way, when there are some people that would rather be alone at times. They nurture themselves when they're alone. Some people, don't like to be in a huge crowd. And we need to know that there are different people, but we also have to be cognizant that when someone really pulls inward and starts to withdraw, the red flag should go up. If we know them at all, we might be warned. So what makes us more prone to loneliness? Factors that, oh, here we are again, Paula. I'll put you on up, well, I'm just moving us so you can see the slides too. I apologize. I think most of these goes without saying, but a trauma, death in our life, or a trauma, physical accident, or a move, a loss of a job suddenly, loss of a home. Look at the people in the Carolinas and in Florida, excuse me, and what they're experiencing. A lot of trauma. And it also is showing them that things aren't going to be the same. Life has to be different. And so many people gain a strength in that, but some people cannot get past it. They fall into a pit of loneliness and really feel like they can't get beyond it. We certainly know that grief can be a source of loneliness, major life change, or chronic illness. When we realize that we all of a sudden can't do what we've done in the past and may not get back to it, and we're getting older. So let's look at some situations that really trigger loneliness in our lives. When do you think, again, now this is again, I think some of these are given, but when do we feel the loneliest? We talked about death, loss of an important relationship, divorce, moving away from friends and family, experiencing a major life change. That could be illness, it could be, like we said, a national disaster that destroys our home, our job is gone, moving away from good friends. And I always think of kids going off to college for the first time. We just sort of take that for granted. It's a wonderful time. And it's also difficult for parents when all of a sudden we kid about the empty nest syndrome, but that's a major life change. Giving up work to raise a family. Excuse me. I mentioned chronic illness and loss of one's independence. Hopefully nobody in this room has gotten there yet, but when we think about getting older and maybe giving up a car or not being able to get out on our own, having to depend, on rides to go everywhere. Some other things are decreasing physical abilities, just what I mentioned, not being able to drive, having to depend on other people, needing a wheelchair, a walker, outliving family members. Darlene lost her mom. I lost my mother-in-law this last May. Ruby, she was 99 and a half. And I can't tell you how many times we'd be visiting and she'd say, my friends are all gone. Everybody's gone. They've all died before me. And we think that's part of life, yes. But when we're the person that's losing people around us, and I think all of us, as we get older, I mean, we're realizing that happens. And even when it's unexpected, it's always a shock, no matter how not planned, but how, if there's a chronic a terminal illness, it's always a shock, no matter when we lose our loved one. Being removed from our stability zones. I'm just going to talk to you about this for a minute. The stability zones are those things in our life that are the most stable always. Our God, our faith, our church group, our family, our close friends. We can move across the country and most of those things stay very stable. Now, granted, if we move across the country, we would change our church family. That in itself can be I was just talking to someone early today, was talking about when she came to Rochester to go to school. And she was, 4 hours from her hometown and she had to make new friends. And she said, oh, what I really missed was my church family, because I'd grown up in that church and all of a sudden I don't have the youth I knew and the people around me. But when we move, for the most part, our support systems stay the same. You know, when one of my dearest friends moved to Richmond, Virginia 20 years ago, and we maybe talk once a month and we just pick up where we left off. And so those kinds of supports are so important. And when you're going through the roughest time, or when someone's feeling lonely, many times it's important to call those people, talk to them, and just fill your reservoir, if you will. You know, we need to have our reservoir filled so that we're half full and not half empty. And so we see it the positive way. So can we count on God? Many people ask this when they're going through loneliness. We want to know where God is. Does he hear us? And that's what that Psalm 35 is saying. Are you there? Do you know what my pain is? Do you know what I'm going through? When life seems depleted, does God really care for us? Do we feel he's there? And we all know that he answers in ways that we're not always counting on, but usually there's an answer. It might be much different than what we thought. When we're facing an onslaught of challenges, will God be there to help? Will we notice his help? When life grows dark and stormy, where's God in that? And then thinking about all the things that make us feel lonely. What's the hardest part of feeling lonely? And I've really never asked that as a question, but when we have a little time for discussion, we'll talk about that, because what is the hardest part of feeling lonely? Is it having to reach out to others? Or is it just being alone with ourselves? I mean, what is it when we're going through some of our darkest hours? What makes it the toughest? So let's look at some symptoms of loneliness. I alluded to those, and you've got a handout. I'm sorry. I gave you a handout on the symptoms of loneliness, the signs of loneliness, a bibliography, and then some scriptural, and I'm missing one. There's 5 of them. Oh, is that everybody? Anyway, you've all got them in for, whoever's with us, Paul, I'll send those to you. I think you got them. Did they come up on your computer? Did you find them?
Right, yeah, you sent them, I have them, yep.
Good, good, good. So let's just look for a minute at these. Decreased blood pressure and heart rate. Why wouldn't that send someone to the hospital if they were having increased blood pressure, heart rate, or chest pain? Sleep disturbances, depression, fatigue, headache, body aches, those kind of things send us to the doctor all the time. When you get to the right side and you think about lower life satisfaction, excuse me, how do you go to a care provider and try to describe that? That's more difficult. And that's when I worry that people tend to withdraw more, because, well, I'm not going to call my doctor and say that I'm having lower life satisfaction. They're going to think I'm really off. And yet that's the kind of thing that sometimes people really need to be able to confide in somebody about. I'm going to give you some statistics in a minute, but loneliness predisposes all of us to earlier dementia in our life. Now that's scary. And there's a lot of research done. And people with loneliness are more prone to Parkinson's disease. And I had the opportunity to speak to people with Parkinson's this summer, and there's any number of research articles that show that people who are healthy otherwise, but very depressed and lonely particularly, but depression can be part of that, in their earlier adult years are much more prone to developing Parkinson's disease. And of course, loneliness is a risk factor for depression and other forms of anxiety. I think I define it probably on the next slide. You know, if we're fearful of something, we usually know what that is. And fear's a little bit more controlled, if that's the word. I used the example when I was talking to somebody earlier today of a spider. I was cleaning up our lake place this weekend, and I saw absolutely the biggest spider I've seen all year. He was about the size of a quarter. He was big. And I don't have a problem with the spider if I have a big shoe or a big wad of paper and I can just grab them. I have another friend that I've seen pass out if she'd seen that guy, it wouldn't have been good, because she just decompensates, her blood pressure drops. That's fear. Anxiety in our life is just an undercurrent of, I'm just restless and I don't know what it is, but we don't know what the cause is. Anxiety is harder because we can have an undercurrent of restlessness. Just, I don't feel good about things for a long time before we can put our finger on it and say, that's why I was so anxious. So that's a bit helpful when you're trying to define them. And also loneliness is a risk factor for cognitive deficits and overall lower cognitive function. And once again, loneliness can put us in a brain fog, if you will. Not just COVID puts people in a brain fog, but when we're overwhelmed with something, loneliness, with grief. Well, we've talked about that. When we're grieving, sometimes we can hardly put one foot in front of the next, and we certainly can't deal with legal issues and paperwork and things that require our astute attention because we just can't focus. So let's look now, those were symptoms of loneliness. What are some of the signs? So avoiding common signs of loneliness, we're going to talk about signs of deeper loneliness. Avoiding social situations with family and friends. And to me, when we start avoiding situations with those closest to us, that's really concerning. Because it's understandable that when you're down and out for a period in your life, you're not going to go out and want to meet new friends necessarily. But when we start pulling away from people that can really fill us up and give us joy, even in the most difficult time in our life, that's when we really need to take note. Fear of missing out on events. Again, loneliness keeps us many times isolated. Inability to emotionally regulate. Like grief and other responses, many times people find that they can't control their emotions just all of a sudden. They're in a grocery store and something spurs a memory and they're crying. And that's what we call normal, necessary, and natural, because you're going through a crisis and you need to experience that. Isolating and withdrawing is probably the most serious, and that is what to worry about the most. Sleep problems and eating problems come with a lot of emotional changes, either sleeping too much, eating too much, or not enough. And when people are lonely, they many times want to escape by sleeping more. Sometimes substance use. People want to drown their emotions. I had a gentleman tell me once, I never heard it put this way, but I've always remembered. He said, you know, Kathy, I thought drinking alcohol would how did he say it? Would cover over my problems, and all it did was irrigate them a little, and they'd be right back the next day. I never heard of it that way, but you know, we think things will cover over the emotions, but they're always there. Signs of deep loneliness, and like grief, if loneliness is not dealt with and it gets deeper and deeper and a person withdraws, it's harder to deal with. The longer we let things go, the more difficult it can be to resolve or deal with. So signs of deep loneliness might be meeting someone for the first time and they tell you their whole life story. They really overshare because they've been isolated. They don't meet people. So now they've found you as a friend, and so they really want to tell you all about themselves. Same as the very bottom one there on that right side of the list, becoming obsessive with friendships. A lot of times a person that's lonely meets a new person and that's the only friend they want to have. You know, they get possessive. And you as the friend might really start to feel that burden because you're trying to support them, but all of a sudden you realize that they're really dependent just on you. Feeling they don't matter. You know, how many times have you maybe heard someone that you're concerned about say, well, I don't really need to go to that gathering. Nobody's going to miss me. They won't know that I'm not there. And many times also people that are lonely really overdo for others. You know, if they do more, be more, they're always working hard to satisfy other people, but they have a real void in their own life, a real depth of loneliness. So just a couple of distinctions between the two to just give you some food for thought, because, whoops, excuse me there. I moved ahead because I was going to move you and I again, Paula. I'll wait. So again, if you have questions, those are on the handout. We'll talk more about them. I'm just going to tell you about a little bit of research. We won't get too involved here. But boy, there's some wonderful online data that's very current and very valid. And so let's look about loneliness impact on health overall. It can have very detrimental effects on many parts of our life, you know, cardiovascular system, our immunosuppression system, various forms of anxiety I've talked about. It can change the neurochemistry of our brain so that we don't have as many endorphins and dopamine neurons that make us feel good and give us positive responses. And it's also important to know that some of the degeneration of that coming with loneliness can make a difference in the future. Loneliness induces a chronic inflammatory process in the body. And we all know that if our cortisol levels and our hormone levels change, that can make a real difference in our resilience, how we respond to things. And then also loneliness is associated with more amyloid deposits in the brain. And I don't profess to be a neurological nurse, but I'll tell you, you don't want amyloid deposits in your heart, certainly not in your brain, other parts of your body, because it's protein and it solidifies. If you get it in your heart muscle, the heart muscle can't be elastic and work. It's rock hard. So what it's saying is that deposits in the brain take the place of healthy brain tissue. There's an association between performance, and you would certainly see that, cognitive levels, performance, ability to perform jobs. Loneliness increases older adults' risk of developing cognitive impairment. Here we go again. In those with mild cognitive impairment. So what can happen if somebody, if somebody has mild cognitive impairment but starts to become lonely and withdraw, that can accelerate quicker. And then the second author by Dr. Jesty, older adults who have normal cognitive function but who are lonely have showed amyloid in their brain on PET scans over their non-lonely colleagues. And lonely people have a higher risk of dementia earlier in life. And then the last fact, people who've had strokes and are lonely and isolated have a 30% chance of having another stroke. And when you think about that, and we talk about here in a little bit, people with strokes many times don't want to go out in public. If they've got a physical disability or something that, their speech is impaired, they don't want to go out because they're embarrassed and they can't communicate. That really plays a role in deeper loneliness. Dr. Rokek, a clinical psychologist in Toronto, has really a lot of data on immunological changes, cardiovascular change, a lot of physiological changes in our body. And she says loneliness has been implicated in everything from increased risk of high blood pressure and heart disease to reduced antibiotic response to a flu shot. So who would have ever thought about that? But, do you ever think about people who maybe react to their COVID shot or their flu shot or their RSV shot more readily might have a lower resistance. And in some cases, loneliness can be a part of that. I don't want to be redundant because some of this is said again that it increases mortality. And listen to the last comment, healthy, lonely people are more prone to early aging. Loneliness is associated with higher levels of sleep fragmentation, and individuals need to feel safe to sleep. Now, who would think of that? I mean, as we get older, if we're living alone, it's harder to sleep. It's harder to sleep if we're going through grief or lonely, but just think that sleep fragmentation really lends itself to early aging and more problems with dementia. So what I'm saying in all of this is we can't underestimate loneliness in our life, that it really has a major impact in so many ways. Now, I told you that I had an opportunity this summer to talk with the Parkinson group here in Rochester. And there is data over and over that Parkinson is associated with a loneliness, and then an earlier level of Parkinson can occur when people are lonely. And it goes on to talk about people that are otherwise healthy. They haven't had any physical disabilities, but all of a sudden have a loss in life or a crisis and they become lonely, could be more prone to Parkinson's disease. And that's separate from heredity and depression and other genetic predisposition. And then just to reiterate that, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, probably one of the most renowned journals, here are the 3 facts that they give us. Loneliness is associated with higher risk of Parkinson's. People with Parkinson's may worry that their illness gets away in their relationships, and that just compounds things more. So the association between loneliness and the risk of Parkinson's disease, independent of depression, genetics, and other prominent risk factors is there. I'm sure you've all heard the expression, I'm gonna move this once more. I'm sure you've all heard, oops, sorry. I'm sure you've all heard the expression that you don't have to be, you can be lonely in a crowd. And you don't have to be alone. And how many times would people say, I could be in a crowd of hundreds right now and it wouldn't matter, I'd still feel alone. So no matter, in the comment that was made was, no matter how many friends we have on Facebook, we can still be lonely. And the thing I want to add to that is, we all have many acquaintances in our life, but how many people are true friends? How many people can we be ourselves with? You know, whether we're grumpy or sad or grieving, how many people can we turn to any time of day or night and they'll accept us for what we are and love us anyway, and we know they're there for us? Those are those support people we talk about. We have lots of acquaintances and hopefully many of them are good friends, but think about that. One of the questions we talk about in support groups are who your closest circle of friends are. Who can you depend on? You know, we might have lots of extended family members, but when there is a loss, everybody in the family is involved in that. And so we can't turn, you know, to, like, for Darlene and I, losing Ruby last May, it probably wouldn't be too conducive for us to try to count on supporting each other as much as going to an objective friend, because we were both caught up in that loss. And we don't always think of that because we think of our family as being those closest to us and our closest friends, and yet they're going through the same pain we are, so they can't be objective. That's not a bad thing, it's just a fact. And so that's why we say to a lot of people, there are times in our lives when it's good to reach out and depend on other people than our family. And Albert Einstein, I did not know this. I did not know what a lonely individual he was. But he was quoted as saying, it's strange to be so known universally, and yet so lonely. And you know, we hear about that, actors and actresses that have brought so much joy to so many people, and then they end their life because they can't deal with the emotional pain. So loneliness is not to be ignored. And like we're saying, it's a pandemic in our country. And I gave you, we'll look at those in a minute, I gave you that whole sheet on loneliness. I've got 3 slides here in apathy, and I'm using them just because I want you to be aware. If you look at the definition of apathy, apathy doesn't talk about being singular or alone. It talks about losing interest and being unemotional about things. My concern is people are more lonely, I think, in this society than apathetic. But I want to compare the two. And it says individuals who are experiencing apathy often exhibit a disinterest in activities or pursuits, and they're emotionally disconnected with things. They don't want personal relationships. They don't get to know people at work. They don't have hobbies. My concern with that is that could also be a lonely person. And so we're not going to spend much time on apathy because symptoms are much the same. But the thing I want you to notice is this gal in this picture, I looked a long time, but there's something different about her than the people who are, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze, people who are depressed and, you know, have the lines in their forehead or in their cheeks. And they just look stressed. Doesn't this gal just look bored silly? I mean, I don't see her as, she could look sad, but I looked and looked for a picture that might depict lonely or apathy over loneliness. And all the outcomes are much the same. If someone doesn't care about their work or their quality of the work, and they're just going through a time in their life where nothing matters, everything's going to suffer. Their work, their housework, their relationships, their family communication. So I'm not so convinced they're different, I guess is what I'm saying. And when you look at tips for managing apathy, and I'm going through this kind of quickly because it's much the same on working with loneliness. You know, and we'll talk about that for just a second here. You know, when we're going through a period of loneliness, it's important to set goals for ourselves, because if we're in the pits, you know, a couple of days can go by and we don't even want to get out of our pajamas or get out of our house. And we have to force ourselves to have goals. And that happens a lot with life change, with illness, with grief. It's not just loneliness. Establishing routine gives us something to look forward to. Feeling as though we're needed and necessary. Engage in physical activities, not that we want to go to the exercise fitness place. And I was telling somebody this week, I tried real hard to go to Dan Abramson after, that's the Mayo facility for it, because I have to go there to have coverage. I can't go to CrossFit or any of the other ones in town. What is the other one? Plant Fitness. I can't go to those because my insurance won't cover. But I really tried hard, but I get there and everybody be in these, little cute little outfits, their jogging pants, and I just felt like the real outsider. But curves and some of the others aren't quite as threatening. I found those helpful. Staying socially connected. It's so important when you're feeling as though you want to pull back and withdraw. Ask yourself why. What's going on with me that I don't want to be with my friends? When we stop wanting to go out to supper, to lunch, or a social gathering that gives us joy, that should be a red flag. When you feel as though you don't want to do the things that have given you joy in life, I think that's really a key comment, is joy is so important. And even after we've lost a loved one, or we're going through the grief process, when we start to see joy in things, or in positive memories, or being with others, that's a good sign of healing. So it's really important to stay connected, and always just knowing what it takes for us to be relaxed, or taking time for ourselves. Does everybody in the room, you too, Paula, does everybody have one thing that they can do to relax that it doesn't have to be a project or productive? You all have one thing you can do to just feel good about yourself and not necessarily have a positive you don't have to create something. Taking a walk in the woods, or just something that gives you some peace of mind and clarity. Everybody have something? Okay. Because it's amazing how many people don't, or if they do, they maybe do it once every 3 months. Doesn't work. We should all have something that we can do 15 to 20 minutes times 15 to 20 minutes a day to take care of ourselves. When I used to read a lot on stress, it would say, if we have something that we do for ourselves 15 to 20 minutes a day, we're well on our way to stress management. That could be a walk in the woods. It could be listening to music. It usually isn't watching the news or reading a newspaper, because they're emotionally upsetting. But just something that helps give you clarity. I think that helps me, saying it that way. Just mindfulness, deep breathing. And it doesn't have to all be at once. You can break it up in the day, and you can certainly do more than 20 minutes. But we have to do at least 15 to 20 minutes to be working on our mental health. And we've talked about professional support. Too many times in today's society, people are told it's a weakness, and it is not. It's a strength to know that we need help and to ask for it. And a lot of times it's helpful to ask people you trust, because, just going to a counselor cold can be pretty scary. And there are some counselors out there that maybe aren't the best. So asking someone that you trust, if you feel like you want to get to know who's out there that you could go to, is very helpful. And then always good nutrition, good sleep patterns. Those are always paramount to any physical health, mental health, emotional health. Whatever we do, we just sort of take for granted that eating 3 times a day is important and sleeping 6 to 8 hours a night is important, but it is. So those are really tips for managing loneliness as much as apathy. I'm going to skip that one. So I want to tell you a couple more things about the positive aspects of loneliness. And I mentioned Mary O'Brien is a young Irish author who wrote the book on Thanks to Loneliness. And in her book, she uses this phrase, although it's unknown. Loneliness is not a misfortune, it's a gift. It's the opportunity to get to know ourselves, to learn how strong we really are, and to appreciate everything and everyone else in our life. Now, that doesn't mean every time we're down or blue, we say, okay, buck up here, Kathy, now. What is it in this situation that I should gain strength from? Hopefully there's something, but it might take talking to somebody or working it through to find what that strength is. And many people do really, really find a lot of joy in solitude. Excuse me. In her book, this is her table of contents, excuse me. And what Ms. O'Brien talks about is all the things that play a part. I'm going to move us once more, maybe, Paula. I'll put us right over here. What are the causes of our loneliness? It's really important to explore that. Do I know why I'm lonely? Do I know why I'm withdrawing from people and life experiences? And always learning to care about ourselves. You know, we hear that over and over whenever we're hearing about mental health. It's important to love ourselves. Negative self-talk is so destructive, particularly in loneliness or grief, where, you know, I shoulda, coulda, woulda done this differently. I'm a bad person. We can dig a hole for ourselves really quickly. And thinking about restructuring how we look at things, treating ourselves with kindness. I always say we need to give ourselves a little bit of grace. And practicing forgiveness is a big one. Many times when people find themselves lonely, they're going through a time when someone they really love and care about has really hurt them, and they're having trouble forgiving them. And, you know, forgiveness is about freeing ourselves up more than freeing up the other person. When I took the Parish Nurse course many years ago, that was a real awakening to me, because I always struggled with what's the true meaning of forgiveness. And forgiveness is saying to that person, I won't forget what you did, but I forgive you, because then it puts it in their ballpark, and then it's between them and God. But, you know, when you hear about people who've gone to the murder of somebody in their family or a child or something and saying, we forgive you, that's sort of hard to get my head around. But forgiveness is about freeing that person up by saying, you know, it's not my problem, it's your problem, and you work it out with God. I'm to a place now where I can let it go. So forgiveness is important. Being able to be vulnerable. We don't all have all the answers all the time, and most of us like to be in control some of the time. And when we aren't, that can really lend itself to loneliness. But it's okay to be vulnerable and to say we don't know all the answers or have all the healthy practices that we should be using. So it just goes on and on about positive identity. It's just a little book. It's a 5x7 book, but it's loaded. So here, Paul Tillich was a theologian and philosopher in the 20th, one of the most prominent in the 20th century, and he compared loneliness to solitude. And I didn't realize that, but I read some of his material. Loneliness is expressing the pain of being alone. Loneliness is expressing the pain of being alone. Solitude is expressing the glory or the enjoyment. Glory is kind of strong, but the enjoyment of being alone, learning to know ourselves. So I have a friend that once every summer goes to the Northwoods. Her husband died a few years ago and of ALS, and she's just had some really tough times. And she goes up to northern Minnesota on Lake Superior and rents this little cabin for 1 week every summer and just spends a week by herself. Goes out on the shoreline and looks out at the beauty. And we talked about this because this year she had family visiting from Europe, and she took them with her. And she said it was wonderful having my sister here from England, but she said I really missed that self time. And sometimes it just takes a week away to give yourself the time. You can't just say, well, I'll take 30 minutes a day, because where does that time go? It disappears. So there is a difference between loneliness and solitude. Okay, what are some of the ways and habits that we can develop to overcome loneliness and support ourselves as well as others? Making self-care practices a priority. I'm going to take that walk for 30 minutes at least 5 days a week. And then do we do it? You might do it a few weeks and then, oh, the other things get in the way. But really, I always say once we feel guilty that we're not doing it, it's become a habit. You know, I try to walk on the treadmill in the snowy weather, and I really slipped up this year, but I got to a point last spring when I would walk, and if I didn't, I felt cheated. That's when it's a healthy habit. That's when you know that you're allowing yourself to do that for yourself. It doesn't have to be walking on the treadmill, whatever it is you do. Staying connected with those support systems, always stay connected to the people and the things that mean the most. And again, talking to people we trust. One of the things that's really difficult in life in general is setting healthy boundaries. What is it that I can do for others that will still take care of myself? And at what point am I walking a fine line or I'm giving more of myself and not enough for me. And we all struggle with that at times in our life. But helping others develop healthy boundaries is important too. You know, if you're talking to a friend that you know is not taking care of themselves, to tell them that, you know, I'm worried about you because I feel like you're getting overtired. Always thinking of things you can do to take care of yourself and staying engaged with people and being involved in things. Pastor Adam just said this not too long ago again, that he really loves it when he sees people in Christ care groups and small ministry groups connecting. And it's kind of hard. I know, Linda, you're brand new. I don't know if anybody snagged you for a small group yet.
Yeah.
Okay, but in pastoral talk about that, but usually there's small groups of 7 to 10. And what's our Christ care group now? Did we say 12? 12 or 13, but some are smaller, and you meet for Bible study or monthly meetings, but it's also a time to share. I know in our Christ Care group, we spend about the first 30 minutes sharing and talking, and it's just a good time to connect with people that we know care about us. And I've talked a lot about seeking support being a strength. And always, always relying on God's word, on God's wisdom, just like this article tonight. You know, when we're really in our deepest hour, our darkest hour, what is it that we can do to reach out? What parts of scripture speak to us? What allow us to really to know that God is there? And remembering that loneliness can either be isolating or solitary. And it's our choice. But I say that with hesitation, because that doesn't mean when you're going through a time of loneliness, you say, oh, well, I should take this as solitude and I just need to be alone. Don't do that to yourself, and encourage others not to do that, because there's a time and place for that. And it's when we can find the beauty in taking a walk in the woods or being alone and listening to music, and it restores our energy. Remember, brings us joy. That's when it's a good thing. And as caring professionals, all of us, you don't have to be a health professionals, we want to be aware of what other people around us that we care about are going through, and trying to build them up and trying to help them develop supports as they're going through a tough time. Max Lucado's book I told you about early on, You're Never Alone. This is a great book, and this is a quote from his book. Life happens when we believe. We find strength beyond our strength, and we accomplish tasks beyond our capacity. We see solutions beyond our wisdom. And he just talks over and over in the book about how God is always there for us. And it really points out things that we can do in our everyday life to take better care of ourselves. And sometimes we just take things for granted. So that's it. And if any of you have any questions that you'd like to send, I would be more than happy to try to answer them. With the Caring Connections group, we really try to get speakers that talk about health-related issues. I think I mentioned before we started tonight that we do have a mental health professional, and that thinks he can give us 2 topics, and he was to speak tonight, but had a family crisis this last week. And so please, if you have any topics that you would like to, suggest, I'm more than open to them. And we'll try to get them on. And the good news is now that we're starting to archive our programs, so you can go to the Redeemer website and watch them, or people that were able to be here can do that. So any other comments that you can think of? I thank you all for your attention and being here tonight. It's an interesting topic. It will only grow, and it's just scary to think of our society and how our kids and grandkids will be affected when, people aren't relating to each other. And so looking to God's important. And boy, I'll tell you, there's so much confidence built and comfort in the scriptures. And, anywhere we look, there's good comfort of just picking up the Psalms and reading them. So I thank you all, and I will turn off the recording here so we can